All right, so the next sewing project I'm going to show you for Halloween is this adorable Quilt As You Go tote bag. So as you can see, I used one of the panels from the retro fabric line. This is from Clothworks and it is just adorable. So I used the panel, one of the panel pieces, and then some other fabrics from the line that I cut down into strips and placed on this bag doing the Quilt As You Go method. It comes together so fast. The only other fabric that I pulled was some orange that I had in my stash to use on the inside because it's on the inside of the bag and I wanted to save all my pretty fabrics. The thing that I love the most about this bag is the handle. This is like a checkerboard orange and black handle that I pulled from the panel as well. It was kind of trim on either side and I just love how this bag came together. So I'm going to show you how I put it together and you'll be able to kind of see that you can kind of make this work with whatever panel you have. It doesn't just have to be a Halloween bag. You could make it any type of bag you want using this method. And I just love Quilt As You Go because it comes together so fast. I made this in just an hour or two. So let's get started on it. All right, so first I'm going to walk through what I'm using to put this Quilt As You Go tote together. So first I just have some batting here. This is what I typically use for quilting, and this is a 100% cotton batting. Now I have it cut to the size that I'm going to use, and the way I'm going to walk through this tote bag is very similar to a tote bag that I have posted on my YouTube channel already. So I'll link to it for you up here. So I have this batting cut to the size that I used in that video as well. It's 16 inches wide by 36 inches long. And what I did, since I'm doing Quilt As You Go method with this one, I have some orange fabric here that I have basted onto the batting. So what I used to base this on is this fuse powder here that I got last year from my Missouri Star Quilt Company Advent box. It's Jenny's Countdown to Christmas box. And I do have a video also showing how to use this and my thoughts on it. I think it works really well for small projects essentially, but the reason I like it is because there's no fumes from it. So it's easy for me to use on small projects up here in my quilt room. So I just sprinkled some of this on the batting and then fused the fabric on top of it. Now I cut out the panel I wanted to use from the retro Halloween panel. This one says Beware of Little Goblins, but it is such a cute panel. I really love that whole collection. So I have the panel and I'm going to kind of center it. Then I have a ton of strips cut for my kind of Quilt As You Go. So I'll work through showing these to you when I get to them, but the first thing I want to do is quilt this panel in place. So because of how Quilt As You Go kind of works, instead of lining these up exactly, I know I need about 1/2 of an inch overlay because of my 1/4 inch seam. So I'm going to move this up a little bit more because I want this panel to fall right at the top. So I can get out a ruler if I need to, but I think I got it pretty good. So this is definitely where I want my panel to lay. I can measure the sides and make sure I'm exactly right, but I'm okay with kind of eyeballing it. If you need it to be a little more exact, then do your measurements. Make sure you have 1/2 an inch here and make sure the sides are the same. But what I'm going to do to base this in place to kind of keep that Quilt As You Go look is I'm just going to sew some lines across here to hold it in place, and then I'll work through the rest of the quilting. All right, so I got a few stitches done to kind of quilt this panel in place. And now I'm going to work on the side panels here. Now I need to do these first before I do that top one, because since I'm doing Quilt As You Go, putting on this top one will cover up the side raw edges here. I cut all of my strips here kind of different widths. I really wanted this to be kind of more of a fun Halloween bag and not be super serious. So they're all kind of different widths. So I'm going to look, and I think these wider ones will work best here because it'll ensure that it covers up the sides completely. So what I'm going to do on these side panels is I'm going to put them right sides together and sew a 1/4 inch seam along here. And I'm going to do that on both sides. Now I can either trim this off because obviously it's some overhang, or I can just add it into the quilting. It won't add too much bulk to just leave it. So you can kind of decide that any way you want. The nice thing about this is you could use any size panel you have. You're just going to be building on to the sides until you cover the entire batting here. So if you have a smaller panel, that's fine. You'll just add on more side panels. So I'm going to sew these in place and then press the fabric to the side. All right, so now that my side panels are sewn on, I'm going to show you how the inside lining of the bag is looking. You can see all of my stitches here that are quilting the batting and the lining of this bag together. Just be aware of that. I decided to go with the black because I figured that it would make it kind of look spider webby and a little bit creepy on the inside lining of the bag, and I'll have some threads here to snip. But if you don't want them to show, just kind of match your bobbin thread with the thread or with the fabric that you are using. All right, one thing that I do like to do on these side panels is I do like to base them in place. I am going to do that though after I get my top, that Happy Halloween, It's Spooky in place. And then I'm going to start building the other side of the bag as well, because it just so happens that the bottom of this panel lines up with where the bottom middle of the bag is going to be. So that works out really well. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to kind of look and see how I want this panel, this strip here, centered on the top of the bag. And I think it'll be really nice if these hats kind of line up right there, because it makes it kind of centered a little bit. So I'm going to bring them right sides together right there. And this panel happened to be pretty crooked, so I'm just kind of going to line it up where I feel like it's even and just stitch across there. So I'm going to stitch 1/4 inch and then fold this panel piece up. Now, if I didn't measure right and if it went past the batting too much, or if there's a little bit of batting left over, I could either put a smaller strip on, or I can just trim the bag. That's what is nice about this, is the bag doesn't need to be the exact measurements that I gave. You can kind of work with it a little bit to work in the fabric that you have. So I'm going to stitch this in place. And then what I want to show you here is I have a couple different types of fabric that I want to use. And I need to make sure, if it's directional, that the top is facing the top of the bag on this end. Otherwise, if I'm going to face it all the same direction on the back, these will all be upside down. So you kind of got to think about that as you work through. What I'm going to do first though is I'm going to add on one of these orange pieces to just kind of match the front of the bag for the first go around. So I'm going to line up with the panel. Remember, these are just kind of overhang, and I'm going to sew my 1/4 inch seam along the side and press it. So I'm going to do that on the top panel and then the panel down at the bottom here. And I'll be able to just quilt as you go the back side of this tote bag the rest of the way through. All right, so I have that cute little strip, the Happy Halloween, It's Spooky Season, in place at the top, and it actually fell pretty much right in line with the top of the batting. So that worked out really well. And then I have the bottom one in place as well. Still have a little bit of those side panels peeking through, I think I'm just going to keep leaving them and building the quilt as you go, going along the back side of the tote. What I'm going to do is turn this panel because it'll help me remember to keep everything upright as I build my quilt as you go. So I'm just going to work through and kind of decide what order I want these to go in now. And if you notice, I'm going to overlap a little bit because as we do the quilt as you go, they're not going to be lined up right next to each other. We're going to have that 1/4 inch seam, so the overlapping will allow me to know if I have enough strips and everything cut. So I'm just going to work through, see what might look good in what order, and play around with them. Remember, I have a few of these as well with the words on here. So I may not keep it in this order. I may decide that I like how it looks right off the bat. The biggest thing is remembering, you know, to have my directional prints going in the correct direction. So I'm trying to decide if I want it all to be black on the back and just leave this orange to the front, because this piece is kind of standing out here since I just have one. So I'm going to see how it looks having this here. Now the issue is I think some of this orange will show on the other side because I'm pretty sure the middle of the bag is right around here. So I need to think about that because I could tie it together, cut another piece of this and use it as the binding on the top of the bag. So it's just something that I need to think about before I commit to putting these all together. But I do actually really kind of like how this looks with just these pumpkins here. So I think I'm gonna go with it, and when I fold the bag together, I can decide then if I want the binding to be this orange to kind of tie it all together, or I could do the binding in the black. So I'm going to quilt as you go these in place. So what I'm going to do is at the sewing machine, I'll fold my first one down right against the raw edge of this last strip here, and I'll sew a 1/4 inch seam across, fold it up, and then I'll keep going in order building these all up. Now hopefully I put enough overlap. If not, I have this last pumpkin one here that will be on top and it'll work out fine. So I'm going to go in order, quilt as you go, sewing all these in place and press them all as I go, and then we'll meet back up here to see how to finish this tote bag off. All right, so you can see I have all of my strips in place. So I have the quilt as you go on the back of the tote bag all finished. I do have some trimming to do. So I have the sides of the bag trimmed flush with the lining, and the top of the bag is also trimmed flush with the lining. So I'm going to bring wrong sides of the bag together. We're going to line it up nice and straight, and we are going to sew a 1/4 inch seam along each side so that we can create a French seam and hide all of the raw edges on the inside of the bag within the French seam. So I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch seam along both sides of the bag. All right, so now that we have the 1/4 inch sewn on each side of the bag, I'm going to turn the bag so that right sides are together. And this time we're going to sew a 1/2 inch seam along both sides of the bag. So make sure here to take some time and kind of rub that seam together to make sure you have everything nice and straight. It'll kind of line up everything. All right, so now I'm going to sew that 1/2 inch seam along both sides of the bag. All right, so I have that 1/2 inch seam sewn along both sides of the tote bag. So I'm going to turn it so I can see right side of the bag and make sure I caught all of the raw edges And you may have some loose threads, so you can trim those now too if you would like. I usually do all of my thread trimming at the end. But now you can really see how the tote bag looks, and it is so cute. It's just such a cute little panel. So we have Beware of the Goblins. We have Happy Halloween, it's spooky season up at the top, and on the back we have the cute little pumpkins, and we have Boo, Hocus Pocus, Beware. How cute is that? All right, so now all we need to do is make the handles and then the binding to finish off the bag. And see inside, this is why I love this method, because we have this French seam here that hides all the raw edges, so we don't have to worry about serging it or doing a zigzag stitch or putting binding on the inside. All right, so let's take a look at the handles. So I already have one made, so you can kind of see how I did it and how it's going to turn out. Now, what I did was I took on the panel I was using, I had this perfect band here that was just under 4 inches, and I wanted to do a 4-inch wide handle because once I fold it, it'll be 1 inch, and that's about the width that I like my handles on the tote bag. So this little section of the handle, I can't remember the length of it now. It is about 24.25 or 24.5 inches. So it's about the length that I like my handles to be. Now you can adjust that to however you want. Since I'm using just this fabric here, I decided to cut some batting so I could add a little bit more padding and bulk to the handle. And this is cut at 7/8 of an inch rather than a full inch. It'll just give me a little bit more room to fold the handle. Now you can see down the center of the handle, I drew a marking. You may not be able to see it, but down the center, I drew a line, and that's where I'm going to fold my fabric into. So this will just kind of hide those raw edges. So I'm going to fold the fabric into that middle line, and I'll use my iron to press it. I'm going to do that on both sides, and that'll kind of hide that band of fabric too. That wasn't really the design I was looking for, but I really love this checkerboard, and I think it would make a fun handle on this bag. So once I got this folded in and pressed to the center, I'm going to tuck my batting into one side, so between the fold and that drawn center line, and then I'll fold the handle again. So that hides those raw edges in the center and then gives me a nice structured handle for this tote bag. And once I do that, I can sew I can sew an 1/8 of an inch top stitch along each side of this handle to finish it off. And then we'll prep the binding for the bag. All right, so now that our handles are sewn, what we're going to do is measure where we want them placed. I usually measure about 3.5 inches in, and then I place the handles just outside of both sides of that drawn line. You're going to want to make sure you don't have any twists in your handles. And I'm going to bring it to the sewing machine and just baste it in place. So at about 1/8 of an inch away from the raw edges at the top of the bag. So just baste it in place, because after we baste the handles in place, we're going to attach the binding to the tote bag. All right, so we have the handles basted in place. And now all we need to do is attach the binding. So I sewed 2 pieces of binding together, or 2 pieces of fabric that are 2.5 inches wide. So I just sewed mine together with a 1/4 inch seam and pressed that seam open, and then folded my binding in half so that the pretty side is showing on each side and the raw edges are together. So I'm going to sew my binding into the inside of the bag first, with a 1/4 inch seam all the way around. I'm going to leave a tail, and I'm probably going to start in the middle of the back of the bag. I don't want to start where the side seams are because that's going to be really hard to sew over with all that bulk as it is. So I don't really want to have to finish the binding at the side seam. So I'm going to leave a bit of a tail, so a 1/4 inch around, and then bring the binding together and then flip it to the outside of the bag and top stitch it in place. After doing that, all we'll have to do is flip the handles up and sew a box around them to finish them off so that they're facing up. It'll be so cute. This bag is almost finished and it is just adorable. All right, so after sewing the binding in place and getting the handles sewn with a little box around them, the cute Halloween tote is completed. So we did that quilt as you go on the back and used the quilt as you go method to put the side panels on alongside of the panel I used. And we have this beautiful trim strip up at the top. I love how this checkerboard handle turned out. I cannot believe how cute this tote bag turned out, and it was so fast to put together using this method. So let me know in the comments what you think. What do you think of this cute fabric, this retro fabric from Clothworks? I'll put a link in the description below on where you can find it if you want to make something like this using that adorable panel. All right, you guys, thanks so much for watching, and keep an eye out for the rest of my Halloween sewing projects. Bye.